Hello all. Thank you today for joining us for the Vincent & Elkins Energy Series presentation on renewable fuel. My name is Michael Joyce. I'm a partner in our Energy and Transactions practice. Joining me today are Alan Alexander, Matthew Dobbins, and Chris Rollins. We're going to cover a couple of broad areas. A brief introduction, cover the types of renewable fuels, the available credits, both tax and non-tax, transactional structures, financing considerations for these projects, and then development risks and considerations when financing or developing a renewable fuels project. So bioenergy is generally a broad topic. It refers to energy produced from biomass. This could be organic matter that is burned to produce heat or energy processed into gas or flue. There's a couple different types that we're going to focus on today: thermochemical or thermal gasification, biochemical, which is anaerobic digestion or fermentation, dairy farms, etc. And then chemical processes, which use chemical agents to create liquid fuels. These feedstocks are varied. They include cellulose-based energy crops, timber, agricultural waste, soybean, food waste. Point being, there's many different potential fuel supplies for renewable fuel. And remember, this is about life cycle and reducing carbon intensity, so really reusing things that are otherwise used in other processes and bringing them into fuel production. So with all the trade winds in ESG and the like, there's been a renewed focus on biofuels. This is not new technology. These are things that people have been developing and financing for some time, albeit on smaller scales. And we're going to spend today talking about some of the various different opportunities and challenges in producing these fuels, financing them, and really the credits that have been the backbone of helping this market grow and are expected to continue to be the backbone for in the short term here going forward. With that, I'll turn it over to Matt to talk about to Alan to talk about a couple different types of fuels.
This one's me, actually.
This one's you? Well, messed it up on the first slide.
So introducing people to types of renewable fuel that are going to be the focus of this presentation. So first, renewable natural gas, which is starting to see more activity in the last couple of years. Renewable natural gas, we're talking about methane generated from primarily either livestock farms, primarily, or from landfills, usually municipal landfills. It is the same substance as when you pull methane out of a hydrocarbon stream that's extracted. And you're basically finding a way to capture, in the case of a farm, an anaerobic digester that takes the animal waste into that digester and traps the methane, and then getting it into a gathering system and then into an interstate pipeline system. Local pipeline system, and then ideally, for purposes of credits that Matt's going to talk about, into an interstate pipeline system for purposes of credits. Same for landfills. You basically have methane that's being generated by the waste materials in those landfills, and then a gathering system that's going to bring that into a gas pipeline system as well. You're going to see these used for really any application that you would normally see natural gas used. That's thermal applications, boilers, greenhouses, and kilns, generation of electricity, vehicle fuel for natural gas fueled vehicles, and feedstocks for bioproducts such as biodegradable plastic. And then additionally, extraction of the hydrogen through electrolyzers for purposes of hydrogen production. We go to the next slide. So renewable natural gas, obviously a key focus, something that's getting a lot of attention recently. In terms of liquid fuels, renewable diesel and biodiesel, which it's probably the most important thing to focus on there is the distinction between biodiesel and renewable diesel. Biodiesel is produced through a different process, transesterification. It doesn't produce what's a drop-in fuel, meaning something that can be substituted for regular diesel on a one-for-one basis. Renewable diesel does do that. That's a hydro-treated biomass product that results in a liquid fuel that's chemically very similar to regular diesel fuel, and can be used as a exact substitute for it and generates the LCFS and RINs credits that Matt will talk about. But renewable diesel has been something that's been, you've seen a lot of announcements of expansion projects at refineries to give you renewable diesel production capability. I think our experience is people are seeing models of profitability, even significant profitability for both renewable natural gas and for renewable diesel that are in large part tied to the value of the credits. That's the carbon offset credits. So the context here is that we're now seeing more than a decade of renewable fuel standards under federal law and the California low carbon statute that are now really starting to take root as the value of credits becomes a primary driver of the development in those areas. And so you're starting to see interest of third-party capital that probably wasn't normally going to be a player in that area. And the prospect, given the decarbonization environment and the ESG environment of people's expectation that profitability should continue, even though certain of those have not, are subject to renewal in the future. Let's see the next slide. I think we might be to Matt's slide. Yes, Mr. Dobbins.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'll take the
magic stick.
Yep. All right. So obviously there are a lot of benefits to renewable fuels from the climate change and ESG standpoints that Chris was talking about. But a big value add are the environmental attributes that are created as a result of the production of these renewable fuels. These environmental attributes are the result of statutory and regulatory programs at the federal and state level. And there's some nuance into what allows a credit to be generated, how you get certain projects qualified. And we're going to go through the federal program, the Renewable Fuel Standard, and then talk about California's low carbon fuel standard as well, which is slowly spreading to other states. And also you're seeing activity in Canada as well and around the globe. So the Renewable Fuel Standard, this was created back in 2005 under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. It was mostly focused at the time with modest production targets. Really, you're talking about corn ethanol, and it was heavily focused on energy security issues, basically finding alternatives to foreign sources of fossil fuel. It shifted quite a bit in 2007 when the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 amended the Federal Clean Air Act to establish what we know and experience today as the Renewable Fuel Standard. Technically, we're living under RFS 2. RFS 2 established the different unique categories of renewable fuels and the statutory targets that had to be hit. And you saw dramatic increases in the targets that were the goals under the statute. So with that as a backdrop, let's walk through. The Renewable Fuel Standard imposes obligations on producers, really refiners and importers of fuels. Blenders, parties that may blend different products together to make gasoline, are not obligated parties under the Renewable Fuel Standard, but they do have the ability to generate credits, and that'll come into play in a little bit when we're talking about. So what the statute does is it establishes a renewable volume obligation based on the targets that are published by EPA. Well, they're supposed to be published by November 30th every year. We'll get to EPA's history of timely publishing targets and what we think we're going to see for 2021, which hasn't been released yet, 2022, and possibly some retroactive changes to 2020 volumetric targets under the statute. So EPA releases the RVO, and an obligated party then has to calculate their individual RVO. Those typically are closely held. It's not really in the public. It's possible to get a general idea of it, but on a whole, we don't really have specific facility by facility data on that. But that's not necessarily important to how this works. So once you have your RVO, you then have to ensure that your transportation fuel that you are selling incorporates or uses renewable fuels. It's a minor distinction, but the RFS doesn't actually mandate production of biofuels. What it does is it says, if you have transportation fuel, jet fuel, heating oil, it has to incorporate or use a certain percentage of renewable fuels. In practice, that distinction probably doesn't mean a whole lot to a lot of people. But if you talk to the law professor geeks, they're going to really harp on the fact that it's not a mandate under the RFS. So I mentioned the statutory targets and how that's set by EPA. We don't actually have statutory targets for 2021 yet. EPA has been missing deadlines since about 2014 with respect to setting the different categories. And to back up a little bit, the categories are the total renewable fuel, the cellulosic biofuel, the biomass-based diesel, and the advanced biofuels. So all of those play together and each one has to be hit, but there are some tricks to hitting them that we'll get to in a few slides as well. So unsurprisingly, because EPA is constantly delayed in setting these targets, we do see quite a bit of volatility in the RIN market. And so a RIN is going to get produced with every batch of renewable fuel. But as I mentioned, we've got this concern of what EPA is going to do with the targets. The statutory mandates actually fall by the wayside in 2022, and EPA has discretion after that to set its own targets for each of the fuel categories. EPA does already have some flexibility under its waiver authority when it comes to setting the individual fuel targets, and we'll expand on that in a little bit. But some important things as a result of COVID-19 are affecting quite possibly what EPA is going to do for this year, next year, and even 2020. We don't have those targets published yet, but they are at the Office of Management and Budget under review. It's expected that they may be released sometime in November. For those of you that have followed it in the media, some numbers have leaked. I'm not going to talk about those numbers because EPA's refused to corroborate those numbers, and other parties have suggested that these are false leaks, that they're not accurate. But there is concern right now that EPA is going to retroactively lower some of the 2020 RFS volumetric targets, depending on the fuel category, from anywhere from 500 million to several billion gallons. And we'll see corresponding reductions in 2021 and 22. That's only going to feed into some of the volatility in the market, despite overall very steady trend in increasing RIN prices. When this leak of a potential EPA downward adjustment came out, you saw the value of D6 RINs slide significantly. There's no guarantee, again, what the EPA is going to do, but you've had many different refiners, a number of governors, including Democratic and Republican governors in states with refinery assets, calling for the Biden administration to provide some relief on the renewable fuel targets. So even if we don't see some of the drastic numbers that were reported early on, it's very possible we are going to see downward adjustments, and that'll further kind of increase volatility in this environmental attribute market. All right, so $1 million question, how do you generate a RIN and how do you make sure it's as valuable as possible? Well, the value assigned to RINs depends in part on carbon intensity, really the GHG reduction that's achieved for that particular type of renewable fuel as compared to baseline fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel. And these can range anywhere from a 20% to a 60% GHG reduction target to hit the RINs. The ethanol RINs don't have to do much more than 20%. The more valuable advanced biofuel RINs are the ones targeting 50, 60%. So once a RIN is generated, when the batch of renewable fuel, essentially a gallon of renewable fuel, is created, the next question is, how does it become tradable? Well, to do that, you have to separate the RIN. Separating the RIN is a little bit tricky, and I'm going to talk about the two most common ways, but there are other ways to do it depending on the type of renewable fuel used. So don't think that everything we're talking about here sets it up as completely straightforward. So one way, if you are the obligated party, when you purchase that batch of renewable fuel, you can separate the RIN from it, and then you're allowed to retire it, meaning surrender it to cover your own obligations. You're allowed to bank it to cover obligations for the next year, or you can trade it. Another way is if you are a blender, if you're blending renewable fuels into gasolines, like to create, ethanol blends. Once you blend that fuel, you've separated the RIN, and again, it becomes, the blender's not going to be an obligated party, so they won't need to retire the RIN on their own, but they can now trade it. And it's traded through EPA's environmental market trading system, an online trading system. There are numerous registration requirements, annual reporting requirements that have to be satisfied. EPA has not designed a perfect system, but every party who wants to play in it should be aware that there are extensive record keeping obligations in here in a way to try and address RIN fraud and minimize the risk of RIN fraud. What is RIN fraud? It's somebody selling a credit that actually has nothing to do with any renewable fuel produced. You saw a significant amount of RIN fraud activity back in 2013. It's not necessarily as bad in 2015. It's not as necessarily as bad as it used to be, though it is still an issue, especially coupled with RIN market volatility. In fact, EPA's Office of Inspector General just last month announced that they were going to be investigating how EPA administers the EMTS to try and address things such as potential for RIN fraud and also the market volatility. Now, if you're an obligated party, somebody who's purchasing RINs, what can you do to protect yourself against RIN fraud? Well, there's an option under the regulations and in the EMTS to purchase a QRIN, a qualified RIN that's generated pursuant to a quality assurance program. Those have, again, very extensive requirements that have to be met, but the benefit of them is it provides an affirmative defense to the obligated party that surrenders it that the RIN was valid. And so that's useful because not only if you end up in an enforcement action where you're facing significant fines and penalties for not meeting your RFS obligation, you still have to potentially go out and buy credits to cover the obligation. So it's a double hit if you end up with invalid RINs. Now, I did mention that RINs can be carried over. There's an important thing to note here. Only 20% of your obligation can be met through the carryover RINs each year. It's not allowed to roll over everything, and it's for a limited period of time. The LCFS, which we'll get to in another slide, is different. LCFS, you can hold those credits indefinitely. All right, some more information on RINs. Each RIN is assigned a D code, and the D codes all correspond to the different biofuel targets. And each one's going to have its own value, as we noted. Now, the chart here represents the concept of what we call nesting. The easiest way to think about it is anybody who's seen those Russian dolls where you have one large one and then a successive number of smaller ones in there. That's this exact same concept applied to the RFS. And what it means is that certain of the more highly valued renewable fuels, like advanced biofuels, cellulosic fuels, they will count for multiple categories in the renewable fuel target. So if you generate a cellulosic biofuel, that will count towards meeting your RVO with respect to the advanced renewable fuel category, the cellulosic category, and the total renewable fuels category. So nesting, provides some flexibility. It's not great, and in part, that's because cellulosic biofuel production and other advanced biofuel production has lagged behind hopes. And so you haven't been able to hit some of the targets that you would otherwise want. That's been addressed through EPA's exercise of its waiver authority. I'm going to talk for a few minutes briefly about that. EPA's got several different levers to pull when it comes to waivers. It's got its general waiver authority, which can be done at the petition of the states or any person or based on the EPA administrator's own discretion. And that's usually done based on potential economic harm or potentially the fuel that's going to be waived, not domestic supply being inadequate. There are other waiver provisions for cellulosic fuel. EPA has a lot of flexibility on that. And when it comes to biomass-based diesel, there's a separate waiver provision, but it's got some specific market pieces that are tied to it as to when EPA can exercise that authority. And in fact, to date, EPA has never issued a waiver under the biomass-based diesel waiver provisions. On top of the waiver provision, you've also got EPA's reset authority. This is how EPA, may be able to deal with some of the cellulosic biofuel bottlenecks in addition to the general waiver authority. If you exercise the waiver authority for multiple years in a row or 1 year and you hit certain thresholds in terms of the percentage of volume you're waiving, it triggers a reset, giving authority for EPA to take another look and deviate from the statutory targets. So we're in a reset phase now for several different categories as a result of rulemakings in 2014 and through 2019. All right, moving on. So these are some of the more valuable, or at least the cellulosic biofuel and RNG decode RINs. You've seen, quite a bit of price difference in what's offered from your standard D6 ethanol RINs compared to others. One other note on RINs and creating different types of RINs. For a long time, there's been a push to generate what's known as an E-RIN. This would be for biogas, RNG, that's used in a renewable, electric power generation, so that you then have created a renewable fuel and also potentially used in EV infrastructure and charging EV vehicles. There is theoretically a pathway that exists, and automakers, the biofuels industry, and the Biden administration have been pushing the EPA consistently for several years through litigation and administrative advocacy to go ahead and start approving projects. But EPA has been very hesitant to do that. They don't feel like they know how they can properly figure out who's going to own that RIN. The general response is leave it up to the parties. Contractually, we can figure it out. And as far as tracing the RIN goes, when it comes to the RNG use, EPA already kind of acknowledges when you drop a renewable fuel into a transportation pipeline and it enters the transportation fuel pool, that they're going to assume that it gets used, even if you can't trace that fuel individually all the way to a particular end user. And so similar arguments could be made about there's no need to chase electrons all across the grid when you can just figure out that we've sent this renewable fuel, it's been used for the power generation. So that'll be an interesting development to watch. Whether or not the EPA honestly has the administrative bandwidth to, push through and finalize something on that will be interesting to see. They have a very ambitious climate agenda surrounding other renewable methane reduction measures. So, people are hopeful, but there's no guarantee. Now we get to the low carbon fuel standard. This is slightly different than the RFS. It's focused on life cycle carbon intensity reductions. You're looking at everything across the chain to produce the fuel, from production, transportation, and storage, to really determine what the carbon intensity is as compared to baseline fossil fuels, gasoline, and diesel. And to the extent you come in under that baseline, you're going to generate credits. These credits are significantly more valuable than what's available under the RFS. They've been subject to some volatility, but not necessarily the same as what you've seen on RINs. But that said, you've seen prices range from around $150 to north of $200 for credits generated under the LCFS. The LCFS comes with a number of other different unique provisions. CARB is not necessarily, when I say difficult agency to deal with, I don't mean that and they're not willing to work with you, but they can be very demanding and they have a lot of prescriptive requirements. And so failure to meet those requirements, again, exposes you to the risk of fines and penalties, loss of the credits, and the need to go out and purchase additional credits. I mentioned some distinctions between the LCFS and the RFS. Notably, the big one is you can carry these credits indefinitely. Under the LCFS, you also can run a deficit if you are a regulated entity for up to 5 years and can pay back that deficit, but you get charged interest. So that's an important thing to know. You have a little more flexibility in terms of meeting your compliance obligations in any given period, but the penalty you might pay for it can be significant. Finally, the LCFS is in some ways both more restrictive and less restrictive than the RFS in terms of who can play in this field. The LCFS has a mechanism for opt-in parties, which most alternative fuel, renewable fuel producers are going to be opt-in parties. Really, your regulated entities are your traditional fuel producers, the refiners, and importers. And so that's important because only a party covered under the LCFS can hold and trade these credits. That's a little more restrictive than what EPA allows in its environmental market trading system. So again, who you are and where you want to play in this space can affect whether or not you actually get to hold those credits. It doesn't mean you can't find ways to get a piece of the value. And, some of that's going to touch on maybe the transactional pieces that we'll go through. But from a regulatory standpoint, you have to be very careful here in terms of navigating who the right party is to hold the different credits. All right. Here's the different types of credits that are available under the LCFS. There's nothing too unique here, though I do want to talk very briefly about opportunities for CCS and hydrogen to play in the LCFS space. And those are really important because all of this feeds into how is capital going to be deployed to support an energy transition in a sustainable way. How are we going to ensure that we're promoting various technologies that many say are essential to a low carbon economy and also to mitigating potential effects of climate change. So CARB has created an LCFS protocol for carbon capture and sequestration projects. It's a little unique. So the key kicker in CARB is you have to sell the transportation fuel in California. LCFS CCS protocol provides one way where you don't actually have to do that, and that's through direct air capture projects and CCS. The project does not have to be in California, and you do not have to sell transportation fuel in California. If you're doing any other kind of CCS project, whether that's with oil and gas production at a refinery or in some other manner, that is going to be subject to the general LCFS rule that you have to be selling the fuel produced in California. There are a few unique aspects to the LCFS CCS protocol. It differs and is much more stringent than the federal rules for CCS. For example, federal rules impose a 50-year post-injection monitoring period. The CCS protocol imposes a 100-year post-injection monitoring period. So there are obviously some constraints, practical commercial constraints on whether or not you'll be able to generate LCFS credits in a CCS project. Hydrogen's another method. Hydrogen has several different, two really different ways to generate LCFS credits. One is through a fuel pathway. You can create LCFS credits either through an established fuel pathway, project-based crediting, or through zero emission vehicle infrastructure. And this is where hydrogen comes into play. If you're building the hydrogen infrastructure, you can then qualify to generate LCFS credits in that manner. And your LCFS credit is going to basically be tied to the nameplate capacity of the dispensing station minus hydrogen fuel actually dispensed from that station. So what I'm trying to paint is a picture of there are lots of different ways to generate credits under the LCFS. Each one is going to have its own unique requirements. So if you already play in one space and you're looking to get into others, don't assume that you're going to know the lay of the land right away. There are different regulatory hurdles to navigate and overcome here. They're not insurmountable, but they are certainly things that have to be, carefully followed. And LCFS, as we mentioned, are growing. Washington just this past year enacted its own LCFS. Our chart isn't updated, but we liked this graphic a lot because it does lay out the different states and provinces in North America that are considering an LCFS. And so, generally in the Pacific Northwest, you are going to see a lot of potential to generate value from these environmental attributes. They do follow roughly the same general regulatory framework, but again, cautionary statement, each program will have its own unique aspects. And so just because you play in California does not mean you will be able to automatically start playing in Oregon or Washington. I think we'll also see LCFS, expand to other states with more progressive climate agendas. We've got New York up here, Colorado. Colorado's announced very ambitious climate targets, and they're going to need a mix of a lot of different options to meet those. And so an LCFS is very likely to see some traction in that state. Now, I'm not going to commit malpractice and start going through the tax credits. I've got very brilliant tax colleagues that can do that. But this slide is important because it feeds into the general concept of stacking environmental attributes and credits, which will really enhance the value of these fuels. You can get these credits from a tax perspective. You could stack the tax credits for blending and producing with CCS 45Q credits, which in turn can be stacked with the LCFS credits. Similarly, RINs can be stacked with LCFS credits and these tax credits. Overall, in terms of general policy directions, we have seen continued support, even though some aspects of each program may garner opposition. Overall, on the whole, no one is suggesting, or I guess I should rather say, there's not majority support for entirely scrapping these programs. There is, a push to adjust things. I use the example of there have been court challenges to change the point of compliance from refiners and importers under the RFS to blenders and other parties. We saw the push to not have a restrictive reading of the small refinery exemption that's under the available under the RFS, and you had the Supreme Court back up industry challengers in that there is no need for a continuity requirement in that small refinery exemption, meaning you don't have to have claimed that exemption from year one of the RFS to claim it in subsequent years. You can take a break. And the idea is because you're a small refinery, you might be subject to different economic hardships. You should have some flexibility there. So all of that does, again, feed into this issue of certainty and potential market volatility. But I would, kind of take the position that that's going to move things at the margins. The programs themselves are fairly stable and likely to continue for the foreseeable future. And with that, assuming I haven't run the clock. Oh, sorry.
Just one note before you, on the tax credits, just they're not tradable like the RINs and the LCFS. So just folks, when you're looking at this, they play by the same rules as many of the other renewable credits. You need to be involved in the production of the ownership.
That's a great point, MJ. And I would add too, we haven't seen the same kind of interest in converting some of these to direct pay the way you have with the 45Q CCS credits. So again, not understating their value, but they might not have as much utility and flexibility as other credits that are available.
Thank you, Matt. So with all that in mind, one of the big takeaways in the renewable fuel space is that a lot of the value is tied up in these incentive programs, tax credits, RINs, LCFS, and otherwise. And we wanted to go through with you some of the transaction structures and project structures, contractual mechanisms we've seen to try and unlock some of the value from these programs. So, as Matt pointed out, renewable natural gas generates D3 RIN, the most valuable RIN. It also generates, a very low CI score due to the displacement of fossil fuels while mitigating methane emissions. Methane is actually a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So on a lot of these agricultural facilities, dairy farms, swine farms, otherwise, the methane just migrates. So if you can capture that, you're capturing what would have been a greenhouse gas and then using it to displace production of fossil fuel as well, contributes to a very low CI score. And right now we're talking about renewable natural gas. We'll get into renewable diesel and biodiesel in a moment. Usually the way these transactions are set up or these projects are set up, I got a structure chart on the next slide. You're going to need a feedstock supply and an offtake structure of some sort. Given that the producer of the feedstock, i.e., for example, a dairy farm or a landfill, typically has no use for renewable natural gas. Now, sometimes in the landfill space, you see landfills that do capture the natural gas and use it to generate electricity, sometimes to supply on-site needs, sometimes to then sell back into the grid. For the most part, you have a facility that's producing a product that it has really no use for. And we've also seen, kind of in lieu of a supply offtake structure in the RNG space, what are essentially credit marketing agreements, whereas instead of an offtake or, a large company will come in and say, I am going to take your RNG, I will market it to, I'll get it into interstate commerce, I'll market it to a vehicle fuel producer in California. And then, I will monetize the credits for you and the RINs and the natural gas, and I'll deliver that value back to you net of a marketing fee. So the problem, we'll discuss some financeability issues with that structure in a moment. But it is somewhat prevalent in the RNG space. As far as the feedstock agreements are concerned, there actually is value in the feedstocks from agricultural-based products. We've seen these structured as $1 per MMBTU produced. We've also seen them structured as kind of a royalty based on either the gross revenue, net income, EBITDA of the project itself. One interesting little data point is until about recently, if you were doing $1 per MMBTU structure, the feedstock associated with these projects actually generated more and was worth more per dollars per MMBTU than natural gas produced in an oil field at the wellhead. That's, those, although with natural gas prices having gone up, the value is now a little bit closer. Obviously, with any project, you're going to need a place to put it. We typically see leases, easements, license agreements. Site access is going to be a big one. In the EPC space, we see a lot more EPCM and construction management models than we do traditional LSTK EPCs, just because RNG facilities are not incredibly difficult to build from a technical perspective. There just aren't a whole lot of the large EPCs that have traditionally focused on them. And so what you usually have are, someone who builds the digester, someone who supplies the scrubber, maybe someone who does the balance of plant, and then you need someone to kind of bring them all together, but that person isn't going to want to wrap it. So we see a lot more EPCM, or in a JV context, a construction management model. And one other point to keep in mind is if you want to take advantage of the California LCFS program, you might, from wherever the facility is located, the landfill or the dairy farm, a lateral might need to be built out to the nearest interstate pipeline or interstate pipeline connection. Because if it doesn't get into interstate commerce, then you can't, theoretically trace the molecule to California. This is the slide I discussed. It just kind of graphically shows how, these projects are put together. You've usually got a sponsor and you got the project company in the bottom. Starting from left to right, you'll have the feedstock supplier, which would be the farmer, basically supplying, the agricultural waste. In a landfill context, it's just there, so you probably really wouldn't need a feedstock supply agreement as much as you would have maybe, a natural gas rights agreement or something along those lines. The landfill essentially has it. They have the organic material. It's degrading underground, and they will essentially, in a way, it kind of looks like a lease. An oil and gas lease will lease the rights to come in and exploit that to a developer. The EPC contractor, the EPCM, or the CM or the CMA, whatever the case may be. Sometimes there's a technology involved in this. The digesters there are some people out there with proprietary digester technology, where the technology licensing is much more of an issue and a much bigger driver of transaction, documentation, is in the renewable diesel space, because there you're dealing with, patented licensable technologies, that sometimes are going to involve catalyst supplies and reforming in order to make the biodiesel. Or the renewable diesel, the services. And then finally, on the O&M front, there are parties out there who typically operate these facilities. The renewable diesel facilities are much more of a traditional refinery and require much more of a heavy hand on the O&M front. The RNG facilities require much less. Essentially, a lot of it's automated. You have people who do need to come in and check certain things, but it's much more low labor, not nearly labor intensive operation. And then finally, as we talked about, an offtake agreement or a marketing agreement of some sort, something to take the gas bundled with the environmental attributes and, derive value from them, typically by selling the gas to a customer, or a vehicle fuel consumer, or, a compressed natural gas company. Over on the left, before we click out of here, this in the biodiesel space, renewable diesel space, we've seen a lot of projects structured as tolls, where essentially the feedstock and the final product is supplied and taken by the same party, and a lot of that can come from either animal waste. Sometimes you might have a joint venture between a meat packer or a chicken farm, coupled with a party on the other side, a trader who might have an interest in taking the final product and marketing it, and they'll come together and agree to, essentially back one of these renewable diesel facilities by tolling through the feedstock and the offtake, which, from a financeability perspective is very attractive. Your supply risk and your offtake risk is essentially handled. If you have a minimum commitment on or a minimum tolling commitment, you simply sit there and as a developer collect tolling fees. So that's a very attractive model too, but again, seen more in the renewable diesel space. So talking about some of the revenue contracts, especially that we've seen in the RNG space, I mentioned marketing agreements, and mentioned that essentially what happens there is the producer takes the product and then markets it, to a strategic or a vehicle fuel consumer, ensures that the RINs and LCF credits are generated, derives the value from those, and then nets back the value to the project company. Usually those net back amounts are less a marketing fee, and that marketing fee, we've seen it in the range of 15 to 25% of net proceeds. What this enables from a transactional perspective is the project company and the developer to get much larger upside than, say, a fixed price, long-term fixed price arrangement, but it's essentially a merchant contract. So there's no guarantee of minimum revenue to producer. Typically, the marketing agreements have outs that say, we have a list of vehicle fuel producers in California who will buy this, but, if we can't, if our contracts with them fall away, then essentially we're off the hook under our marketing obligation. And said another way, there's no guarantee of price, there's no guarantee of volume, and there's no guarantee of term. It's, essentially a pure merchant contract. But the reason it's attractive, or given the returns, because given the credit stacking that Matt was mentioning earlier, if you can stack a RIN with an LCFS credit plus the price of natural gas, it varies because the RINs and the LCFS credits fluctuate in value, but we've seen them in the $80 to $90 range. And an RNG, a dairy farm RNG facility, is a pretty low CapEx development operation. So at those prices, you can realize a return on your equity pretty quickly in a relatively short time period. And again, we've seen this one a little bit more in the agricultural-based RNG space. In the landfill space, because the landfills generate more gas than does a farm, we've, and the landfills are, the facilities are already there. Lots of times they're already required to, capture the gas, as we'll talk about in a moment. And the landfill isn't really in the business of, marketing RNG. It's much more attractive for them to just enter into a long-term fixed price arrangement. As we mentioned over here on the fixed price offtake agreements, though, you can get terms, 3 to 10 years, but the prices are a lot lower, as compared to the potential price you could get from credit stacking on the marketing arrangement side. What we've seen the landfill RNG contracts look like is anywhere of 3 to 10 years and $12 to $18 per MMBTU, and an agreement to translate or transfer the associated credits to the final off-taker. And the final off-taker, usually a trader or someone, will take the risk or realize most of the upside on marketing the credits.
So Alan, real quick on the difference in price there, it's not just the fact that you have a fixed offtake versus this marketing agreement with more variability. A lot of that value distinction, I think, is tied up in the LCFS distinction between dairy and landfill.
I think that's right. Dairy farm RNG does generate a lower CI score, from what I understand, than does landfill RNG, because the landfill RNG is already required to be captured. Also, from what I understand on kind of the CapEx side, the landfill RNG requires different type of equipment or more equipment to treat. It comes out a little bit dirtier than does the dairy farm RNG. But that's right. You don't have the additional CI benefit for landfill RNG that comes from capturing what would have otherwise just been escaped methane. So I think that is part of it as well. If it were to be a pure credit, pure merchant play on the landfill side, you may not be looking as much at $80 to $90. You'd certainly have the RIN. I don't know what the LCFS credit would trade for there, but it would probably be less. So it's a very good point, MJ. I'll just say this from the get-go, and we probably should have mentioned it from the beginning, kind of an ever-present risk, and Chris will touch on this a little bit more, in the renewable fuel space because the value is so tied up in credits and governmental incentives is change in law risk. What is going to happen if the government, policies change and these credits either, go away, aren't renewed, something happens to change their value. So you see everything from it's an issue in both. What we usually see are either just flat termination provisions, or in the offtake or in the fixed price offtake, you might see price adjustment provisions or reopeners. But in either case, it's not a situation anyone wants to be in, but it's also a risk that's impossible to ignore with these types of deals. Moving along, we might have talked about some of this already. Landfill RNG versus agriculture. Landfills are generally the lowest cost RNG resource, one, because they're already there. The gas collection systems have already been required to be in place for a long time. Because they generate more gas, there's economies of scale. And so there's relatively lower cost in interconnecting them to a pipeline as opposed to dairy farm. Even the large dairy farms, some of the largest ones I think produce maybe 10 to 15% the amount of kind of the typical landfill. And because the landfill, like lots of times, the CapEx has already, been there. They're already capturing the RNG. They're already sometimes even using it to produce electricity. So they just turn off the generator and then, connect to a pipeline. The capital can be recouped, much, more quickly despite the lower fixed price and possibly the lower credit value. As we mentioned a moment ago, the lower credit value is due to, the fact that the gas is not escaping into the atmosphere. Agriculture, we talked about dairy a lot. Those are probably the most prevalent, but we've seen swine farms and poultry farms also do agriculture-based RNG products. They're relatively small scale. They're spread out all over the place, typically in the Midwest and the Northeast, although we've seen some in Texas and the Southwest as well. Oftentimes they're relatively isolated. And even though, the CapEx is pretty low, I'm used to doing 9-figure infrastructure projects, and I think you can do a, moderately sized dairy farm RNG facility for, $40 or $50 million. It's comparatively more expensive to the landfill where, for the most part, the infra is already there. You may need to, build a lateral to connect to a pipeline. And however, as we've mentioned, these CapEx costs, these somewhat higher CapEx costs, are offset to some extent by the ability to get a more valuable LCFS credit. Now, what we have seen, and we've seen a number of our clients try to put in place and building up RNG platforms essentially, is you will find hopefully a large farm that is somewhat close to a natural gas pipeline or a lateral that connects to an interstate pipeline. And you will build a facility there that can process more gas than the facility, than the farm itself, the dairy farm, can produce, because there will usually be other farms, within a certain radius that might not be as large or might not be as close to the natural gas pipeline. So what you'll want to do is essentially sign up agreements with those farms, but because they won't have the connecting infrastructure, you will need a trucking agreement to essentially collect the gas at those other farms and truck them into the to what we call the hub. It's essentially a hub and spoke model, where you have one big farm where you've overbuilt basically the processing and scrubbing capacity so that you can truck in gas from other farms and process it through the central facility. Renewable diesel is a little bit different. As you mentioned, RNG generates D3 RINs. Renewable diesel is typically D4, D5s. A renewable diesel facility is essentially a small refinery, and refineries are complicated process facilities. So you're usually going to have agreements and things you got to think about that you're not going to have in the RNG facility. Like I said, landfill, it's mostly already built. Dairy farm, it's a big swimming pool with a tent over it and a scrubber. So here you've got, a small refinery. So you're going to need robust utility arrangements. You're going to need, exact utility loads, water and other utilities provided to exact specifications, electricity and, higher voltages. You're going to have technology licensing arrangements with large international proprietary technology owners, Haldor Topsoe and others. You're going to have to negotiate agreements with them for the technology. Oftentimes, because you're reforming something, you're going to have a catalyst supply agreement. You're going to need to negotiate with one of the industrial gas companies, because in any refining process, you're going to need hydrogen supply. You are possibly likely going to be an emitter, although you might be Matt can correct me on the terminology here, but a low emitting facility, but you'll still need to go through the air permitting process. There's probably going to be a stormwater permit as well. So the permitting considerations here can be a little bit more complicated. But what we have seen with these facilities is, and what is very attractive from a financing perspective, is you can set them up as tolls. The suppliers of the feedstock sometimes also have use for the renewable fuel, depending on who they are. So they will supply you the feedstock, take the fuel away, and they will typically require also that you're getting your tolling fee, but they'll require you to, as the developer, to do the paperwork to generate the RIN and then transfer the RIN to them, and they'll take the RINs with them. You could also do this as a feedstock offtake model. You could also do it as a supplier marketing or a marketer model. We've seen those as well. Biodiesel, for example, when you talk about biodiesel, it's not renewable diesel. It's not a drop-in fuel, as Chris mentioned earlier, and because of that, it can't be shipped via pipeline due to operational and technical difficulties. You can't blend it with normal diesel above certain percentages. But renewable diesel, because it's essentially a drop-in fuel, can be shipped via pipeline without any real major modifications. So, one additional attractive feature of renewable diesel. But, one other final consideration on renewable diesel that I failed to mention in any bullet points is it's kind of constrained by, and Chris will talk about this, there's only so much, restaurant waste, and other sorts of feedstock out there that can be processed, whereas biodiesel from corn ethanol has a much greater, feedstock availability. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand the clicker off to Michael Joyce to talk a little bit about, how you would finance some of these neat projects and transactional structures.
So any of you finance types in the audience have probably been thinking about some of the things we've been saying as anathema in the finance world. No fixed contract price, smaller size projects. So uncertainty of value of credits, particularly with the EPA dragging its feet. So we're not going to pretend that there isn't a lot of variability in these projects. What we will say is there's also a lot of potential upside, and they benefit from strong motivations and interested parties in ESG in terms of finding places to invest. I spent a lot of time in wind and solar, relatively mature markets these days. You've got a lot more activity in them, but as folks look to expend those dollars and put them to work in renewable features, they might look at some of these for other reasons. Do they lend themselves well to debt? Not necessarily, but maybe the government DOE loan program can support that. So a couple of things off the top, as we mentioned, the long-term volatility of the LCFS and the RINs are not optimal for financing. That said, they also have these CapEx numbers are lower, as we've mentioned. So you've got a shorter return cycle, and purely on an equity model, probably a lot more willingness to take the leap of faith that, well, as Matt said, the changes are there. They're likely to be around the margins in terms of the valuation in the foreseeable future. And with a repayment cycle of anywhere between 4 to 6 years, that's a little bit easier to manage than a longer term payment on your CapEx. Again, the small size of these is problematic in terms of just getting enough bang for your buck. Any transaction costs money to get done, takes time and attention. $25 to $50 million doesn't necessarily excite a ton of folks, but there is a lot of money to be made on the upside of these transactions, particularly as we said, while the programs might change and the nature of them and the adoption of them, there is clearly a driver to reduce carbon, whether it be through capture or less production of carbon in this case. So we don't see the market falling off entirely. We see movement around the margins. And while that might lead to a haircut or only being able to borrow against a certain portion, financing does seem to be available. Do note that this is there's a lot of buy-in across the industry on all facets. The industry itself, the emitters, the off-takers, the folks that need to meet their RFS requirements, and other folks who are taking advantage of market opportunities. So there's a couple of stats that we posted up here on the slides talking about some significant players. Some, like Clean Energy's entire business model is driven around renewable fuel, whereas others like Chevron and BP are more traditional energy players who have leaned into the space for both profit and social reasons. The pressures that they face from government authorities, shareholders, et cetera, to kind of clean up their carbon footprint. And where they look at where they spend their dollars, again, pointing back to those other renewable markets that get a lot of attention, wind and solar. The Chevron, they do play in that space, but are they going to change it? Are they going to make a ton of money? Are they going to do enough to really move the dial? Not necessarily, as opposed to where they can find other value in things like carbon capture, sequestration, renewable natural gas. Now, as we've been talking about this in preparation for the presentation, it doesn't fit necessarily a traditional project finance model in a tidy way, which is to say, in some ways, debt will be less available. Again, I point to the DOE loan program as a way to potentially support some of that. So point being, there's a lot of interested parties. We spent a lot of time, we've had a lot of inbound inquiries, frankly, in this space. Part of what motivated us to put this presentation together and get our arms around what we collectively knew, because the opportunities there, is it clean? Yes, in terms of production. Clean in terms of financeability? No. But the interest, the opportunity will continue to drive development. And I heard some stats to the effect of, whereas you had maybe 50 dairy facilities, RNG facilities in 2018, we're looking at like upwards of 150 in development now. So the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, in terms of the fact that people are out there and building these things and taking advantage of all these different tax attributes, credit attributes, and the long-term upside. So I talked a little bit about, we've spent a lot of time in this presentation talking about RFS targets, and Matt mentioned how they're only set through 2022. But while the program might change and the EPA certainly has more discretion, no one's expecting a complete overhaul. Certainly there'll be some form of program. Obviously, we've had a new administration who has spent a lot of time and been in the press very heavily for trying to get that agenda through Washington in terms of the dollars and cents cost to those of us taxpayers in these programs. But they have been steadfast in their support. And while maybe the blender producer credit doesn't make it in there, even though it's a small dollar number on a budgetary ledger for OMB, it's in there today, or in there as recently as we've been able to confirm. There's also talk about seeing an ITC for RNG and using, a credit that we've used heavily in the solar space to incentivize RNG. Now, some of the issues that we've talked about in financeability about offtake agreements and the low-hanging fruit in more mature markets such as wind and solar might make that less attractive to folks and maybe even counterproductive in this space. But the point is, people are talking about it, focusing, the government's looking at many other ways beyond what's there today, where they can use some of their other widgets to continue to encourage the production of RNG. USDA grants, another place which we've mentioned that bring to bear here. The program shifted a little bit over the recent years, but one of the things that survived is the rural elements that are administered through 1RD today. So the USDA, I said the DOA earlier, I realize I'm kind of stuck in my old world of the 1603 program and the like, but the USDA is still administering, taking applications. In fact, Alan, I think you mentioned to me that you saw one of these merchant agreements, these marketing agreements, have financing traction because there was a loan guarantee attached to that. So those loan guarantee programs, generally, it's similar to what you've probably heard about. The 80% of the total debt would be guaranteed. There are issues in managing the government's participation in the program and what you need to do. It's not a free program. There's costs inherent in that as well, but it does help fill some of these gaps that we've been talking about. The states are heavily active as well. They've been driving a lot of this. As Matt mentioned, California pushed through in, what was it, 2011?
It was back in 2009, and yeah, it might have become effective in 2011.
So we've had that for a while. Oregon has the Clean Fuels Program, SB 98, which is a voluntary RNG target. Minnesota has the Natural Gas Innovation Act, which pushes cost recovery. So there's the states have been playing, and then the local folks as well. I mean, these financings or projects, putting aside a financing, can take advantage of tax abatement agreements. We've also seen tax-exempt bonds and municipal finance. So a lot of interested parties. We're all interested in a cleaner environment. So we're seeing that purchase, so to speak, in the context of these projects. So Chris, you want to kind of start a discussion here about some of these challenges?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, guys. So this next series of slides is a bit of a slice through some of the topics we've already covered from perspective of, particularly if you are doing an acquisition of a business like this, what things might you focus on in terms of understanding it and or due diligence. Also relevant for developers or people looking at making an initial formation of a business. But I think we've hit a good bit on the feedstock supply issues. And the key takeaways there are, obviously, you need to understand your source of supply to ensure long-term viability. Livestock RNG and landfill RNG they have built-in sources of supply that you're going to understand for the most part. In a landfill, you're going to have a good understanding of the gas that's, that landfill's able to generate. In livestock, you might have some issues with a decrease in the size of the animal population on the farm that you have to protect against. And I think Alan has seen, and Mike, the transactions where there are limitations on the ability of the farmer to do that, or penalties if there are some issues with that. So
covenants to maintain a minimum herd size. Yep.
Right. Head count.
Yeah. So there you're gonna have some natural protections. It's a little bit less of an issue there. And renewable diesel and biodiesel, but particularly renewable diesel. Alan mentioned the used cooking oil limitations of availability during COVID when restaurants were producing less of it. And you also have basically trade-offs between land use for crop production, land use for energy production, and land use for forestation. And so you run into policy issues, but in particular, I think for renewable diesel to increase substantially the way a lot of people in the industry hope that it will, you're going to have to see some streams of supply that expand beyond what the predictions are currently. And there probably is potentially some motivation to do that at a policy level. Acquisitions of different types of assets. So one thing that we think will become a focus as there are transactions, particularly where these assets are trading hands, are timing elements of a transaction. You'll have compliance periods where your RINs and LCFS credits are tied to that, and particularly in the renewable fuel program, you're going to have limitations on your ability to use those in subsequent years. So a lot of transactions, well, it's standard in upstream oil and gas transactions that you're going to have effective time concepts and basically lockbox structures about when you're going to get the economics of that business. And we think similar things are going to likely to develop around confirming the credits and the value of the credits and the time periods by which you're buying the business.
Well, we've seen it in the offtake contracts as well, Alan. I mean, we've seen that recently in the discussion of storage and kind of price adjusters, because it's not different in the cart in front of the horse model. In some cases, you need an offtake agreement or a marketing agreement stood up to support a financing or just getting your equity freed up to invest.
Right.
And you don't have your pathway set. So how do you manage that in a contract? Right. It's one of those challenges that we've seen.
Yep. Exactly. So we'll likely see that imported into M&A agreements when those start proliferating to a greater degree. Earnouts may also become something that's useful to prove out the value of one of these businesses as well.
Yeah, especially on a merchant, if it's a more of a merchant arrangement, and you can see an earnout becoming very attractive in a purchase agreement.
Right. Refinery conversions and brownfield projects, and Matt, you may want to talk about this a little bit, but allocations of pre-closing environmental liabilities. When you're taking a facility that was used for something else, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Alan and I have seen a number of these, particularly interest from private equity. You've got a lot of the majors selling off old refinery assets, in part because of, one, it's a difficult business, right? Two, they're facing the ESG pressures to decarbonize or at least kind of shift some of their investment focus. And while idled refineries are potentially great in terms of you've got something already on the ground you can work with, a lot of these are very old assets, lot of environmental problems, and the majors have very little appetite for, a more equitable allocation of environmental liabilities. I'll put it that way.
That makes sense. Acquisitions of development projects, when you have a midstream project or a project in mid-construction, ensuring that project gets finished.
Particularly without a wrap. I mean, that is one
Yeah,
of the challenges, having all these different, you need someone who can effectively manage
Right.
it.
So are you seeing mostly transitions services arrangements for that, Alan?
Yeah, what I've mostly seen on this is some sort of arrangement whereby the seller stays on, essentially, to make sure construction continues to get done, because the seller has a relationship with the contractors or the EPCM, or maybe, one of the JV members who's a construction manager. The construction time periods on, an RNG facility are pretty short. I think even on a renewable diesel facility, they're a little bit longer, but about 2 years is what I think. So it makes sense, especially if you don't have a fully wrapped EPC, to just ask the seller to stay on in a transition services arrangement to make sure, things get through to completion, as opposed to purchasing a project mid-construction and having to get up to speed with where things are and how it's done, and having the owner's team extracted and then having to insert a new one. It just seems to, not upset the process to keep the seller involved.
Right. Moving on through this. So considering solvency risk, particularly with respect to livestock farms, is not an easy one to address, but something that at least you need to think through, and whether it's a particular risk for where you're going to be putting the RNG infrastructure. But there clearly is a possibility of farms entering into insolvency or bankruptcy, and considering what will happen if that happens and how you're going to handle that, particularly with creditors and new owners, is key. And I don't think we're seeing a lot of creative solutions to that.
Yes.
But something at least you want to vet from a diligence perspective, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of thought as to how to address this issue. Everyone knows that family farms are sometimes not the best credit risk in the world. And, although there's been a lot of creative thinking about it, there hasn't, yet we haven't seen any good solution, brought to bear. So at this point, it remains more of a diligence issue, we would say. It was just kind of understanding, the farm operation, and, making sure that as far as at least a family farm operation goes, that it's in relatively good financial shape.
Right. I think Matt already hit nicely on the RIN and LCF compliance issues, but basically, if you're the purchaser of an invalid RIN, then you're going to have the double whammy in terms of you need to supply a RIN if you're a producer, and if you have an invalid RIN, now you've lost the value that you used to buy that. So that's their Dairyland Farm LLC, the LCFS CARB enforcement action on that is an example of that that's from May of this year.
Yeah, that was an interesting one that Alan and I have talked about a couple of times, because it's CARB exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction, essentially.
Yeah.
The farm, Dairyland Farm, was not in California, and the compliance issue there had probably nothing to do with anything that would affect the CI score. But CARB regulations, again, are very prescriptive in terms of what they expect from any party in the LCFS space.
And is that one resolved yet, as far as we know?
I don't know.
Yeah, we need to check.
Yeah, I have not seen that it was.
Yeah, I haven't tracked it. So,
and I think we've hit on the RNG financing and marketing agreement point, and talked about the financeability and those considerations. So.
Right. And in an acquisition, they have the same sort of thing. How do you model, what the business is going to be worth if you're essentially purchasing a merchant facility? You're going to have to make your own assumptions. So,
right. I think that brings us to a conclusion, and hopefully a helpful CLE for our audience.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yep. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you also to two associates who helped us put all these slides together, put a lot of time into it, Caroline McDonald and Eric Slavin. So,
thank you, folks.
Thanks, everybody.